Let's break down 5 of the most underrated players heading into the 2025 fantasy football season. These are 5 players that I continuously see fall back in fantasy football drafts, and these 5 players you are going to want to make sure that you draft and that you don't let your league mates draft them before you. Let's start the video with David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions, a player that was on a phenomenal pace in 2024, and it feels like nobody is giving him any respect heading into the 2025 fantasy football season. This was the RB18 overall in 2024, scored 12 touchdowns, and was still the running back 16 in fantasy points per game, only playing in 14 games in 2024. And I think a couple of the reasons why David Montgomery is sitting at an ADP of 55.2 is because of the departure of offensive coordinator Ben Johnson. And then also, we saw such an emergence of what Jahmyr Gibbs can do last year in the games that we ended up seeing David Montgomery miss last year at the end of the season between weeks 15 through 17, although Monty played a little bit in week 15. That's the game he got hurt, right? But a couple positives to go over here for David Montgomery. An argument, first of all, John Morton, the new offensive coordinator of the Lions, has been raving about David Montgomery all off season long and has only given indication that they are going to use David Montgomery in similar ways to what we saw last year. Then every implication from training camp has been a lot of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery on the field at the same time. And these two just play off of each other's strengths. There's such a good 1-2 punch that I just don't see any scenario where David Montgomery won't be a huge part of the offense in 2025. That Sonic and Knuckles combo is not going anywhere. And David Montgomery gets a ton of goal line work at the end of the day for the Lions, and he had a ton of opportunity overall when we look at things last year. He was the RB13 and red zone touches last year, even with Jahmyr Gibbs, still getting plenty of usage in the red zone as well. So honestly, whenever I am going like zero running back or hero running back, and I get to that point in the draft where David Montgomery is an option, I just have a very difficult time passing on him. He's the perfect RB2 that I think is an absolute great mid-round steal right now, who could absolutely outperform his ADP. He's been a top 25 or better fantasy football running back 4 seasons in a row, and I don't see that changing whatsoever. Once again, he's going to be a big part of the offense going into 2025. And even if Gibbs is, truthfully, of course, the running back who has like the pass catching upside and maybe just the upside overall, I still don't see a world where it's going to be such a drastic change in volume to Jahmyr Gibbs where David Montgomery is not still fantasy relevant. And we look back to last year, the pace he was on was phenomenal. Leading up to that week 15 game where he got hurt against Buffalo, he had only given you a single-digit fantasy game one time all year long. And while the upside was capped because Jahmyr Gibbs was still having a very good season alongside him, Jahmyr Gibbs, no single-digit games last year whatsoever, David Montgomery was still incredibly consistent, gave you a safe floor every week, was a great RB2 or flex option. And heading into 2025, I think he is once again going to be an extremely consistent RB2 or flex option for your guys' fantasy football teams. And he is being extremely overlooked going into the next fantasy season. Next up, I want to talk about Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, a player who every single offseason, no matter what, just is absolutely disrespected when it comes to mock draft season and ADP when it's time to actually draft. Currently sitting at an ADP of 50.7 on the Sleeper app. Devontae Smith finished as the wide receiver 27 in 2024, but only played through 13 games last year. You guys will see his season stats on the screen, but in the last 3 years, he's been the wide receiver 20 or better in fantasy points per game, and he's been the wide receiver 19 or better in the last 3 seasons, excluding last year where, like I said, he finished as the wide receiver 27 overall. But we still look at the stats. If he had played in a full season, he would have easily finished as a top 20 wide receiver. Still, off of 89 targets, 68 catches, 833 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. He was still on pace for a very good year. Let me break it down a little bit further. I know Devontae Smith, like the curse of Devontae Smith is that he has a couple of those goose egg games, 2 or 3 of them every single year. But outside of that, he's always phenomenal, right? When you look to last year, 3 single-digit fantasy performances, including the 0.8 performance in Week 7 against the Giants. But outside of that, double digits every single week. And he was a league winner last year. 28 points in Week 15, 11.1 in Week 16, and 30 in the fantasy championship. And I know a lot of people a little bit concerned about the Eagles in general because they ran the football so much last year between Jalen Hurts and, of course, Saquon Barkley as well. But I think you could actually argue that in terms of the passing game, they're due for some overall regression at the end of the day. And they're probably going to throw the football more in 2025 in comparison to 2024. So I think that's very good for A.J. Brown and our guy, Devontae Smith. So I've loved both of these players at their ADP throughout the course of the offseason. But Devontae Smith is that guy each and every year. You're going into the 5th, 6th round, and he's just always there as one of the best flex options in full PPR. There's no way that I'm passing on Devontae Smith moving into 2025 fantasy football. All right, speaking of underrated wide receivers, let's talk about Jacobi Meyers of the Las Vegas Raiders. And yes, I have talked a lot about Jacobi Meyers throughout the course of the offseason, and he fits the mold for a lot of videos that we've done over the course of the offseason. But once again, this is a player sitting at an ADP of 82.3 that I find myself leaving so many fantasy football drafts with, because this, once again, has been a top 30 wide receiver 4 straight years in a row, the wide receiver 24 or better in 2 straight seasons. And last year was the wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game, also was the wide receiver 24 in 2023 in fantasy points per game. So he's finished as the wide receiver 29 or better in fantasy points per game in 3 straight seasons. Now, not an incredible amount of upside, tied to Jacobi Meyers or anything, but he's been playing with mediocre at best, if not just straight up poor quarterback play ever since he joined the Raiders. And now he gets a much better quarterback overall in Geno Smith. Say what you want about Geno, but a huge upgrade from Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell last year. Undoubtedly a better offensive system led by new head coach Pete Carroll. And while the Raiders will probably attempt to run the football more with rookie running back Ashton Genty, and they have a great pass-catching tight end and Brock Bowers and some other names on this roster like Donta Thornton making some buzz, Jacobi Meyers is locked in as the true wide receiver 1 for the Raiders and is in line for a ton of volume in 2025. So that is literally my entire argument for drafting Jacobi Meyers. I mean, he's a late round wide receiver. I don't think he's going to break out or do anything crazy or have super high ceilings, but the consistency that you will get with Jacobi Meyers will be there week in and week out. He's a player that you guys are going to be able to rely on in the flex and not be concerned about it each and every single week, and especially against soft secondaries this week. I do think he will have some nice spike weeks when he is finding the red zone. And once again, a top 24 wide receiver 2 straight seasons in a row, being drafted far out of that range. I once again just find myself, when Jacobi Meyers is on the board, available in the later rounds of fantasy football drafts, drafting him left and right. This is a player that you guys cannot leave your 2025 fantasy football drafts without, because he's going to have an extremely stellar year in 2025. All right, let's talk about another running back, and let's go with sophomore running back Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants. In his rookie season was the RB26 in fantasy football, 839 yards on the ground, 5 touchdowns on the ground, and 1 receiving touchdown, as well as 284 total receiving yards. Tyrone Tracy did that with not even being the starter for the first 4 weeks of the season. We had Devin Singletary in front of Tyrone Tracy. And when we look at that stretch, weeks 5 through week 17 for Tyrone Tracy, he only gave you single-digit fantasy performances 5 times. Every other game, double-digit fantasy points. And we saw some nice ceilings out of Tyrone Tracy. 22.7 points in week 6, 23 in week 8, 19.3 in week 14. And I know there is an elephant in the room here. Rookie running back Cam Skattebo, who a lot of people like, and I do think is a good prospect, and I do think he could fit the mold for a kind of a 1-2 punch here for the Giants. But I feel like throughout the course of the offseason, with Tracy sitting at an ADP of 87.2, like the fear of drafting Tyrone Tracy has just become a little bit too extreme. And for me, in a lot of drafts and mock drafts, he just becomes a very solid value. This is a player that you're drafting as your RB3 or 4, that you're drafting in very late rounds, who could easily, especially for the beginning of the season, just be straight up the starting running back for the Giants. We haven't had any real implication that Cam Skattebo is going to come in here and take away a ton of volume from Tracy. Plus, so far, and I know it's early in the offseason still technically, but Cam Skattebo has been nursing a hamstring injury, hasn't even got to play in a true preseason game yet, and has missed time throughout training camp, which to me only adds value to Tracy. But don't get me wrong, Skattebo could be ready week 1. Who knows? We'll find out. Ultimately, I just think this is Tyrone Tracy's backfield, and he's being kind of overlooked because of the addition of Cam Skattebo, and also probably because not a lot of people are super bullish on the Giants offense, which is fair, but I say it year after year. Bad offenses still produce good fantasy players. And once again, the risk reward very low here because the draft capital baked into drafting Tyrone Tracy is so low. And ultimately, once again, you're drafting Tracy as an RB3 or 4, depending on how you guys are putting your teams together. So I've been drafting a lot of Tyrone Tracy. I think it's his backfield to lose. And until Cam Skattebo takes it from him, I'm not worried about things. And even if that starts to happen, I still think it'll be a 1-2 punch between both running backs, and Tracy could still have plenty of fantasy relevancy. So once again, great value here, a player that's just been overlooked all offseason long. I'm drafting Tyrone Tracy when he's available on the board heading into 2025. Let's go over one more sophomore player to wrap up the video. That is Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. And I will admit, I've been a little bit back and forth in terms of what 49ers wide receiver I've been targeting throughout the course of the offseason, but I think that's pretty fair to say that the Niners wide receivers in general have been pretty up and down throughout the course of this offseason, right? And we're still at a point in the offseason where I think Ricky Pearsall is an absolute steal in drafts, going at an ADP of 101.7. And in the past week or so, right, we've had the emergence of a calf injury to Jawan Jennings. We've had Kyle Shanahan come out and say that Brandon Ayuk's earliest return would be week 6, which, knowing Kyle Shanahan, that probably means Brandon Ayuk won't be back till like week 10. We'll find out. And also, we've just seen a plethora of injuries to other wide receivers on this team. Jacob Cowing has been banged up. Jordan Watkins has been banged up. It seems like every wide receiver who's not named Ricky Pearsall at the moment has been dealing with an injury. And I know Ricky Pearsall at a point was on the injury report, then off the injury report. I don't know what's going on in that San Francisco 49ers wide receiver room, or what kind of bad water they're giving the Niners wide receivers. But right now, Ricky Pearsall is the healthy wide receiver who's not holding out for a contract like Jawan Jennings is as well. And ultimately, I mean, there's a lot to like about Ricky Pearsall's rookie season. We missed the beginning of the year. We all know the story there, but ultimately in games where Ricky Pearsall had 6 or more targets last year, he gave you double-digit fantasy performances in each of those. In games where he had 4 or more targets, he gave you double-digit fantasy performances in all of them except for 3. And once again, the Niners offense wasn't 100% last year. I anticipate they'll be much better in terms of offensive line play this year. There should be positive regression there. And just with a healthy Christian McCaffrey, this offense should look different. But, I think even if this offense does have struggles this year and the wide receiver room is banged up, if Ricky Pearsall is the last man standing, then the volume will be there alone just for Ricky Pearsall to be productive in fantasy football. And I think he's going to be a true kind of security blanket, great PPR option throughout the 2025 season. In terms of what we've seen out of training camp reports for Ricky Pearsall, it's been nothing but rave reviews. positive reviews, impressing throughout the course of training camp. And ultimately, I am still a fan of this Kyle Shanahan offense. Let's not forget it leads to a lot of production when it comes to fantasy football, and they were still top 5 in terms of most passing yards in 2024, even if things felt rough overall. Let's not forget this is still an elite offensive system at the end of the day. So I'm in on Ricky Pearsall right now. ADP is amazing, and I will say, I've kind of anticipated an increase in Ricky Pearsall's ADP over the past 2 weeks or so, and he's just not a player that's changing in ADP, and I find that very interesting. And I'll still take some shots on Jawan Jennings because there's definitely a world where Jennings is ready week 1, and maybe this calf injury is more to do with the contract than anything. And I still think that Jennings and Pearsall can be productive when they're both on the field and be viable fantasy options. But ultimately, there's just something about Ricky Pearsall right now that feels right. I think he's going to be a very consistent, safe floor flex option for you guys in 2025. And I'm drafting as much Ricky Pearsall as I possibly can at this current ADP as we approach 2025 fantasy football. That'll do it for today's video. There are 5 extremely undervalued players heading into the 2025 fantasy football season that I think you guys need to start drafting more of. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long: free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. If you have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop me a comment down below. I'll get back to you when I can. And of course, when the playlists pop up here on the screen, wherever they pop up, make sure you guys check out all of the other content we've put together for the upcoming 2025 fantasy football season to help you guys dominate the upcoming fantasy year. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.